Salut tout le monde. Welcome everybody. Come on back. We're getting started with the second half of CIREQ Interdisciplinary PhD Student Symposium on Climate Change. We are heading into our third panel of the day, and here to introduce our presenters is Geeta Nori. Thanks, Geeta.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed your meal. We are gonna go to the next panel on critical perspectives on origins of environmental crisis and economic growth. It's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Sophie from Department of Art and Philosophy from UCAT. Sophie, you have 10 minutes to present. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Geeta. So good afternoon. My name is Sophie Albuquerque, and I'm an occupational therapist and an occupational scientist, and I specialize in health promotion through an occupational perspective. If I could have the slides up, thank you. And I'm currently a PhD student in philosophy and applied ethics at Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. Today, through the exploration of an economic perspective of human doing, I'll argue that an occupational perspective captures much better the value of everyday living. So I'll start by giving the floor to established economists to challenge the state of the matter. Next, I'll challenge the economic perspective and its approach to everyday living, using the question, to what ends do we get occupied, to highlight an occupational perspective. First, let me briefly introduce what I mean by an occupational perspective. So understanding human occupations means looking at all the actions we perform throughout the day that occupy our space and time, allow us to exist, adapt, and connect. This perspective captures the forms, the functions, and the meanings of these occupations. For instance, today we are attending a conference as a main occupation, but that involves many more discrete occupations, like, let's say, going to the toilets several couples of times during the day, commuting to here, or networking, or managing our times and prepping our presentation while juggling with a busy life as a PhD student. So all at once, that makes our everyday living. So let me start by, we have the double screen here? Yeah, we could have. Yeah, sure. I can catch my breath. Thank you. Oh no, it's stuck on that. Oh, that's awful.
Thanks so much for your patience, everyone. We're just dealing with a small technical issue, and we'll be right back. Yes, you're live.
Just bear with us, those of you in the space and online. We've lost a network connection and we're reconnecting. Thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. If we can get the notes out of the way. Awesome. Awesome, thank you so much. So let me start by stating that economics matters. If that statement won't quite shake your world, that's the point that both Gayatri Ghosh and Angus Deaton question, so please have a read. Economics matters because economic decisions impact everybody's lives on a political level, and these decisions rely on who's got the power. They shape our life patterns, they define our choices, and they govern our policies. Meanwhile, economic models have known to have become too technical and often too obtuse, some are even wrong, yet we trust them with our lives. Economic policies often focus on growth, reducing welfare to a measure of GDP, while the production and consumption of goods and services dominate what is considered important in our lives. And yet, economics is a bit ubiquitous in how we lead our lives while failing to address what truly matters to us. This is not me saying, this is Gayatri and Angus. So because a productive life matters in economics, this infographic tells us about providing healthcare. Let's view it as an occupation, providing healthcare, but from a management perspective by McKinsey. So let's start reading the mission statement at the very bottom. McKinsey helps leaders defend against disruption, reimagine work, and build a thriving workforce. So from an occupational perspective, those are three clearly laid out occupations that seem to matter for good management and productivity. Occupationally speaking, let's wonder to what ends the management is occupied with. We find answers in, if you look up the infographic, improving productivity, reducing expenses, and aiming for economic growth, while protecting the leadership and improving work for productivity. Behind providing healthcare as an occupation that matters, as commented by Ghosh and Deaton, what matters is literally what matters to the economy. That's the point made. Thriving is about how the people in it can be productive and make more money while saving some. It's that plain and simple, comically so if it's not so tragic for the implications it bears on the meaning and the quality of our lives. This tragedy shapes our reality day by day. Leading a productive life is the output of technical and obscure economic incentives to occupy our existence for the purpose of productivity. All right, Sophie, you're going to tell me. I mean, but we need to work for a living, right? I argue that we need to wonder to what ends are we occupied? Work is only one occupation in an occupational perspective among many. Viewing the continuum of occupations in context, we can apply what could occupy us with meaning and purpose towards collective flourishing, and that is the complexity of everyday living. There is a deep disconnect between what we value, let's say friendship, connection, love, and how we value what we do. The problem with the productivity mindset is the whole grip on life trajectories. We get an education, we get trained, we get access for the sole purpose of work, labor, and production. Since economics deem them central to our thriving, discrete patterns of activities or unpaid occupations remain unnoticed. We arguably do them out of love or out of habits or because we have free time, because they're not productive. Another common assumption is the value of technology to replace tasks of small value and move them to more meaningful doing. I call it the technological fallacy of value creation. Technology replaces our human skills and boosts our productivity, and the booming of generative AI is bound to reduce our human interactions dramatically and replace our complex tasks instead. So value provides meaning and purpose to our existence, but since GDP is our beacon of value, it beams toward more productivity. This reductionist approach to our welfare is literally throwing us under the bus as existential threats, because the drivers of being occupied are production and consumption. And finally, in an occupational perspective, every day matters. Daily living matters so much that the best predictor of achieving an education and helping kids stay in school is to make sure they have access to the restrooms. That is what matters. Daily occupations become the resources we need to aim for with an occupational perspective, and it's the real game changer in that work just becomes one of the many occupations that matter. Regarding technology development, it can inform an ethical technological framework in service of human and ecological development, since occupations, rather than skills or productivity, would be taken in consideration. And finally, an occupational framework contains descriptive and explanatory features regarding the purpose of human doing. It can also provide prescriptions for policies across the diversity of contexts, of needs, and possibilities for living a good life by enhancing access to significant occupations. And that'll be all, and I thank the committee for accepting me after that presentation. And this is just a little tongue-in-cheek about productivity in academia and meaningful occupation as surfing, social media, and communications. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophie. So our next presenter is Gabriel from... Thank you, Sophie. Our next presenter is Gabriel from Department of History, UCAM. You have 10 minutes.
Hi everyone, I'm Gabriel Beauchamp, PhD candidate at the University of Quebec and Montreal, and I'm specializing on the questions of African agriculture in the colonial context of the 19th century. Most of my research has been centered on Sudan, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. As a subject, the study of agriculture is a profoundly human one, but also intrinsically linked to the study of the environment. There has been a growing conscience during the last 5 years among researchers and journalists that the current climate crisis has roots older than commonly thought, and that those are deeply linked to colonialism. Academic historical research on the subject is still in its infancy, but it clearly shows already that the practice of colonialism is directly linked to deforestation, desertification, aridification, and the loss of biodiversity. Using the example of colonial Sudan, one of the earliest large-scale colonial states in sub-Saharan Africa during the 19th century, I want to briefly present the interest of such an analysis. Just for a little bit of context before starting, Sudan was under the colonial rule of the Egyptian state from 1821 to 1885. This colonial expansion was born out of the desire of the ruling elite in Cairo to extract the riches of the Sudan, mainly thought at the time to be gold, ivory, and slave, to finance the creation of a modern, Western-inspired industrial state. It is one of the earliest cases of large-scale colonial occupation of the African interior. As a reminder, during this period, the European presence in Africa was mostly limited to the coastlines. Two other elements are making this case so unique and interesting. First, it's a non-European colonial state, and secondly, it preceded the European partition of Africa in 1885 during the Congress of Berlin. So being, it's one of the earliest examples of the transformation of the environment brought on by a colonial state in the African interior. One of the most interesting elements that has come out of this research is the clear evidence that there is already during the 19th century a widespread conscience among locals and Westerners that the environment along the River Nile is rapidly collapsing. We notice in the written sources that Western visitors, mostly those who are staying in the colony for a long period of time, sometimes are noticing the degradation. Their accounts and journals are filled with mentions of drought and destroyed forests. More importantly, the locals are also witnessing those events. The farmer says that the rains are decreasing, the woodsman that the forest is disappearing, the hunters that his preys are further and further away. Those are some of the examples that we can extract from the sources hinting at a changing environment. But one of the most complete analyses on the subjects comes from a French engineer and employee of the Egyptian named Alfred Chélu. In his book, De l'Équateur à la Méditerranée, published in 1891, Chélu blames the collapse of the environment in the Nile region on the Egyptian colonial state. Chélu cites the rapid urbanization of the colony and the rampant use of steam engines, both brought by the colonial regime, as the main causes for the disappearance of the Sudanese forest. He believes, quite rightly, that this ecosystem was the cornerstone to maintain the climate integrity of the whole region. The French engineer also theorized that this environmental collapse will affect rainfall patterns and eventually the flow of the River Nile. This hypothesis, which was quite avant-garde for its time, tended to exclusively focus on the hydrological side of the equation while neglecting the rest. So we see that during this period, there's not only a clear conscience of the changing environment, but also that some peoples have already targeted colonialism as the source of the problem. Alfred Chélu was right on some of the causes of climate change that he had witnessed, but he had a somewhat limited view of the regional problem due to his mostly exclusive stay in the Khartoum district. In the Greater Nile region, we can identify other causes that are affecting the collapse of the environment. First, for the man-made one, we have the land clearances for the agricultural purposes, initially to build large plantation estates for the colonial elite. Then there's the over-harvesting of wood for artisanal and industrial uses. The lumber was principally used to construct the colonial capital of Khartoum and to build a riverine fleet to acquire and export local resources. The few riverine forests of the Sudan were particularly vulnerable due to their limited sizes. Then there's the overgrazing and burning of forests to open up land for pasture. The growth of the new colonial agricultural system was pushing the pastoralists to seek new lands for grazing. Finally, there's the over-extraction of gum arabic for commercial export. The over-extraction tended to kill the acacia trees, one of the dominant species of trees in the Sudanese forest. Secondly, there is some natural causes that are absent from the sources but must be taken into consideration. First, it's possible that an El Niño southern oscillation cycle is causing the decline in rainfall. To briefly define what it is, it's a cyclical change in the winds and water temperature in the Pacific Ocean that can cause either periods of heavy rain or drought in, but not exclusively, East Africa. Secondly, there is evidence of an extended natural drought period in the early years of the Egyptian rule from 1821 to 1826. Droughts are not uncommon in the region, but one lasting for 6 years is a quite rare event. Lastly, there is a high probability of a progressive natural aridification and desertification cycle in the Greater Sahel region. But despite those hypothetical natural causes of climate change, the arrival of an extractive capitalistic colonial system in Sudan is a more likely culprit. As I have shown, there are tangible links between Egyptian colonialism and the collapse of the environment in Sudan. As such, To find the causes and potentially the solution to the current climate crisis, we must look to the past, a phrase that historians will always repeat when confronting current problems. Also, we must acknowledge the deep links between climate change and colonialism and strive to decolonize not only our vision of the past, but our present conception of environmentalism. To help in such a process, I highly recommend the book Decolonial Ecology by Malcolm Ferdinand. The author, whom I had the pleasure of meeting at the beginning of my research a couple years ago, reflects on the role of history, colonialism, and slavery on the modern ecology and on Caribbean societies. I hope that this brief presentation piqued your curiosity on the subject of the history of agriculture and the impact of colonialism on the environment. I also hope that you see the interest to integrate this kind of analysis in your future work and that it will lead to further cooperation between us. Thank you for your attention, and thank you to the organizer for such a wonderful event.
Thank you, Gabriel. So our next presenter is Josephine from Trent University.
Historians like paper. Thank you. Thank you to those of you who are making this exchange possible, and to thank you here and those of you online for your engagement. In this session, we're addressing origins of environmental crises, but that raises the question, why are we still doing this? Canada, like other developed countries, has been trying to fix environmental crises for more than 100 years. Crises of conservation, pollution, and resource use, yet things are arguably worse now. Capitalism is often blamed, but critiquing capitalism hasn't fixed anything either. I argue for the value of examining first principles, the ideology that underpins Western capitalism, and also, I hope, for the value of historical memory in marking propensities, with reference, in this case, to Canada and aquaculture. Canada, the state, was created by and for resource development, using the term resources to include land, water, and what's on and in them. It's a complicated ethos because liberal democracy is intimately tied to resource development. And while the former is widely supported, the latter is often contentious. A quick review of the classical liberalism and liberal democracy. Its core tenets, alive around us, come from John Locke. In Locke's conception, and in Canada, individualism and equality are often conflated as freedom, but they're in the service of property. Liberalism is an ideology of property. Two common definitions of it, two ways of saying a similar thing, that property is not a thing, it's a right, which is clear in legal language, but it doesn't make the term property rights a bit redundant. The hierarchy of liberal property, according to the exclusiveness of the rights claimed. The state of nature has no claims on it, but it may be claimed. So it's the raw material of liberal society. A commons consists of some agreed sharing of rights. Locke acknowledges its existence, but mostly ignores it. His goal, and liberalism's goal, is enclosure, which is accumulating property that is bounded and exclusive and thereby private. Enclosure happens through improvement, which means putting labor into the state of nature to make wealth and to make it private simultaneously. A liberal government's only job is to protect private property. Those not improving or privatizing are not part of that society. These core features of liberalism have had most attentions, perhaps because of their societal implications, but other core features have had more direct environmental implications. In liberal theory, resources are limitless. Locke hedges this a bit, but his hedge makes liberalism an ideology of frontiers, justifying, for example, colonization or rights to things like pore space in soil. Externalities, the side effect or consequences of improvement, positive or negative, though usually taken as negative, don't exist in liberal theory. Until the 20th century, any such thing was seen simply as a nuisance. And a third arena for environmental contention is liberalism's ambiguous stance on common property, acknowledged but not embraced. Many thinkers, two notable examples here, have addressed the problem of liberal limitlessness. That is the reality that there is no such thing. Macpherson does it by challenging the supremacy of private property, Dagan by creating new regimes for it. Both, however, focus on the social justice dimension. Macpherson does recognize the link between property accumulation and environmental problems, but this is an area that has not yet been well explored. More frequently discussed is the liberal stance on externalities of improvement. Pigot was among the first to recognize them, calling them a social cost and proposing that the problem causer pays to fix them, the source of what we now call the polluter pays principle. Coase, by contrast, argues in a Nobel-winning analysis that users or society benefit from improvement and so are best positioned to pay for its problems. The debate is alive in carbon pricing measures. Locke's aversion to the commons became amplified ideologically by later fights against communism and by extension to other forms of collectivity. Hardin was key to applying this aversion to the environment, arguing that the collective rights of the commons deplete resources and destroy ecosystems. Ostrom, in another Nobel-winning work, refuted the thesis, and Hardin himself had to walk it back. Yet, the tragedy of the commons still walks among us as a zombie theory. This ideological polarity is complicated by resurgent indigenous approaches, which range from reconstructions of purely traditional, mainly collective systems, to hybrids of traditional and liberal property. It's useful to examine liberalism's features in aquaculture because it's one of Canada's newest extractive industries. Dynamics are clear in its development, and water has been at the forefront of Canada's environmental action historically. Traditionally, aquaculture has been practiced around the world for millennia without apparent opposition. But in the mid-20th century, there was a push to industrialize, and in several regions, this became a problem, especially in Canada. Most striking is government's role in the industry's origin story. In the late 60s, Canada's fisheries were in serious trouble, and federal officials blamed it on fishers, describing the Hardinesque tragedy that their irresponsibility inflicted on fish stocks. One solution was to restrict fishing with quasi-private rights, but even better was to create a new industry in which private ownership of fish and private rights to open waters would prevent resource tragedy. The justification was an argument taken directly from liberalism's own origin story, the Lockean enclosure of Britain's common lands. With government help, industrial aquaculture appeared first on Canada's east coast, very shortly afterward in the west, and decades later in the Great Lakes. Large-scale aquaculture requires private rights to large bodies of water for pens, anchors, and buffer zones. In other words, the exclusive tenures are larger than the pens that you see. Aquaculture conflict followed industrialization and is still a defining trait of the industry. Reasons for opposition vary, but underlying themes emerge. Not surprisingly, one is enclosure of previously public waters. Government sees the waters as a resource to be assigned to create improvements and wealth, but people see them as theirs, for government to protect and keep for common use, as you can see from some of the posters there. Conflicts also arise over limits in that the small number of sites suitable for aquaculture are also prime sites for other human and ecosystem uses. Externalities are many. They include disease, interspecies conflict, oxygen depletion, and pollution. Industry tries to address some externalities up to a point, but mostly it leans on its role as a benefit to society, that is, a job and wealth creator, to justify its practices. A growing Indigenous presence in, oops, did I miss something? Okay, sorry, I have to go back. Okay, I think I mixed up two slides here. Okay, I must have messed something up. Anyway, a growing Indigenous presence in industrial aquaculture adds to the complexity. Some nations see it as a direct threat to traditional practices and want it stopped. Others see industry regulation or even participation as a way to advance self-determination in their traditional waters. In both cases, the nations themselves are the government protecting property. To sum up, there's been a continuity of trouble with limits, externalities, and commons since the early 20th century crisis of conservation that we saw, and the mid-century crises of externalities and usage conflicts. Trouble persists because tackling the problems of improvement requires disentangling them from the widely held liberal democratic beliefs. I argue this is hard to do without an appealing alternative ideology. An example of the problem is in the role of the state. In Canada, the role extends far beyond the classical liberal role of protecting private property to enabling improvement and privatization in the national interest, thereby enabling the problems that come with it. Many people may not agree with the role, but it's hard to disentangle from our liberal democratic value system, and challenges collapse under arguments about benefits to society. Challenges to improvement challenge our broader values, and the challenge is often masked by language. Different segments of society often use the same words, but they often mean different things because the ideology of the user behind the words isn't clear. Of the points here, I've only alluded to the exclusion of the unpropertied and its implication for the environment through the resurgence of Indigenous agency, but that's a very big topic for another time. So this is all that I really have to share with you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Our last but not least presenter is William from McGill University.
Awesome. All right, so you might know when this slide comes up, I'm going to be talking about something a little different than is on the program. I just passed my comprehensive exam less than a month ago, and as you know, maybe after that. Thank you. Your committee usually tells you to focus on some slightly different things after that. So I'm going to present the overarching theme of my work, which kind of covers what I initially intended to talk about. It's called the Human Chronome Project, Quantifying Human Activities Through Global Time Use. And so I guess start this off, Sustainable Development Goals. These are, wide-reaching, but hard to measure progress for. And so I think there's been a widely called for in literature calls for human-focused metrics to measure our progress towards Sustainable Development Goals. And second is that it needs to be a global view, lest achieving one violate another. And so, I'm coming from the background of Earth system science. And if you don't know what Earth system science is, it considers the Earth, the whole Earth, and all of the different spheres of it as a complex system that all interact with different matter, different material, and different energy fluxes all interacting. The interesting thing is that humans traditionally have been excluded from this framework and continue to be, poorly understood and inconsistently defined. And that's really important for the idea of the Anthropocene, because we're driving massive changes. Our activities are driving massive changes on the planet. Climate change, biodiversity loss, technological innovation, the list goes on. Now, where does time fit into this and human activities? So I'm interested really in how humans are interacting with the physical Earth. I want to resolve this human component of this human Earth system. And particularly, how do we go from having, as if we can just make the window a little bigger, just from these activities, which are these physical, observable aspects of our behavior, which then lead to dramatically different changes in the state of the Earth, different physical outcomes for the planet. And I'm aiming to do this by using time. And so the idea is that any outcome, any change in the state is the result of certain activities applied for a certain amount of time collectively, with the added contextual variables such as technology use, culture, geography, etc. So this really gets to the crux of what the chronome is. The chronome is a term that encapsulates the YouTube. Not quite. The chronome is, it encapsulates a quantification of how, a quantitative description of how societies partition their time. And so it aims to be, first off, holistic, meaning that it covers all people of all ages in all countries, 24 hours a day times 8 billion people, that's 190 billion person hours experienced every single day being directed towards some set of outcomes. Second is that it needs to categorize activities according to a single consistent dimension. So as just an exercise here, if you see this activity, this yellow machine here, if you're trying to describe what it is, it's going to depend on what background you're coming from and what uses you want that description for. So first you could say, if you observe it and you say that is paid work, that is a social context. You can also describe it as operating machinery, which is a technological or technology use component. And finally, it is coal mining at the same time, which is a physical outcome. Because I'm interested in the Earth system and humanity's interaction with the Earth system, I'm looking at these physical outcomes. The good news for this is that there's lots of data globally on how we spend our time. So again, if you can see there are 70 countries with at least one time use survey covering much of the world. And there's 165 countries with labor force surveys. And the reason we put these two together, time use surveys are these national level, nationally representative instruments deployed by statistical agencies to capture what are you doing in your average 24 hours. But within there, they do not resolve economic activities. And we know that economic activities are really important, specifically regarding climate change and extraction. And so I complement that with labor force data, which explicitly resolves what the economic activities are. Now, just as an example of the mess, if you can imagine globally, each country, they have different contexts, different policy goals. There is no single common classification that's adhered to for either these time use activities, so you imagine describing just your daily activities, or for economic activities. And so we had to develop a framework for putting these together so that when we speak globally, so that we can speak globally and that we have common ground there. So we focused on the physical, as I mentioned, the physical outcome dimension. So we made something called the MOOGLE, which is the Motivating Outcome-Oriented General Activity Lexicon. It's a mouthful, but really focus on the motivating, like outcome-oriented. So these are the physical outcomes that were intended to be brought about when you did the activity, keeping in mind the fact that any activity has many aspects or dimensions to it. And so if we could just blow this up a bit, it's a 3-group, 8-category, 35 subcategory hierarchy. And it starts with the question, was this activity motivated by the intention to tangibly alter a physical component of the Earth system? Think soil, rock, buildings, so on. And if yes, then we classify that as an external outcome. If no, was it motivated by the intention to change the location of people or things, or to manage or organize systems? And if yes, that falls under an organizational outcome. And if no, then was it motivated by neural, mental, or somatic engagement? And that falls under a direct human outcome. Now, we put together this as an example of what the data could look like. Imagine an average day for the average person on Earth. Or alternatively, imagine the world was a single person and had to accomplish everything that goes on. So this diagram here sums to 24 hours. Every cell is proportional to the time, and so the sleep, 9.1 hours, and then that's our allocation of time to the broad categories. I'll just blow this up into the more detailed categories and draw your attention to what are the technosphere creation and what we call technosphere creation and maintenance categories, where the technosphere refers to our built environment, all of our non-living creations, including raw materials and energy carriers. And the sum of these cells is about 45 minutes per day. And I think that for your average person, one out of 8 billion is going to spend 45 minutes per day total on all these things, manufacturing everything, extracting all the oil and gas and rock and gravel. I think that's a remarkably small amount of time, considering that these activities are responsible for the movement of 70 gigatons, so 70 billion tons of material per year. And I'll just move on quickly to make the point, this is an interdisciplinary conference, and I want to say that this time use perspective has really enhanced and driven some cool interdisciplinary research in my group. And so the first, again, looking at this technosphere idea in this 45 minutes, our material stocks and material uses are growing exponentially, as I said, reaching 70 billion gigatons per year. So we want to understand this human contribution to it. And the second is within transportation, we were looking at the time spent moving around day to day. And of course, different people spend wildly different amounts of time traveling on a daily basis. But at this population level, so including everyone from children to elderly, on your average day, it is invariant across the spectrum of GDP. So it averages out to around an hour per day. And so we revisited this hypothesis from 40 years ago about a psychologically bounded constant travel time. And that had some interesting implications, particularly for energy use per unit time, as opposed to energy use per distance traveled, as it is usually measured, for example, liters per 100 kilometers or liters per passenger kilometer, and instead thinking about something more as liters per hour or megajoules per hour. And so I'll just leave that off here. The project, there's a website, the Human Chronom Project. We have a Zenodo repo from the paper, The Global Human Day. If you have any more questions or would like to chat, I'd be more than happy to, or clarify anything. I know it's a pretty broad shot there. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, William. Thank you for all our presenters for the insightful presentation. So it's time for Q&A. If you have any question or any comments, it's a good opportunity for you to delve into the topic with our presenter.
You can just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Just curiosity, this question is to Gabriel. I'm like, so you are talking about Egyptian colonialism, but Egypt was not independent at that time being, right? So either Ottoman or British rule. So what do you mean with colonialism? I mean, like, what's the definition of that?
It's already on. From 1821 to 1885, Egypt was theoretically under the rule of the Ottoman Caliphate, but it was virtually independent due to the rule of the Mehmed Ali dynasty, who was an Albanian dynasty who ruled Egypt after Napoleonic invasion. But the British occupation of Egypt only started in 1882. So we can speak about Egyptian colonialism, but some sources prefer to speak about Turco-Egyptian colonialism. But it's a quite changing, because initially, from 1821 to 1830, it's mostly Turkish officers who are colonizing Sudan, but after that, it's mostly Egyptian who are ruling. So we can speak at that moment of mostly Egyptian colonialism, but there is quite a debate about in Western academia about speaking about non-European colonialism, because it's seen as a somewhat taboo subject, like only Westerners can colonize. So it's something we can speak about for maybe 100 hours, but it's the gist of it for now. I hope it answered your question.
Yes, I see another question back here.
Thank you. This is a question for Joe. Oh, there you are. I was wondering, so an idea that I've come across in the literature that is fairly recent is this idea of granting rights to elements in nature. So like, for example, granting a water body its own set of rights. I wondered about your perspective on that.
Well, it's come to Canada with the Magpie River. I'm afraid I don't know what the name is. It's non-English name, but I was told by a law professor that this is the idea that has most excited her law students, is this idea of the rights of nature. And it's certainly being used or being proposed as something in northern Manitoba to fight for social justice. My own feeling is that it is applying liberal theory to nature to fight the consequences of liberal theory. And I think that, we've been grappling with the ramifications of liberal improvement and those kind of dynamics for a few centuries now without a lot of success. So there's got to be some experimentation and innovation to try to accommodate it. And if rights of nature are the way to do it, I mean, we do have to acknowledge that this idea of the rights does come from a liberal source and it's got pitfalls, but it's something to try. It's my very inexpert view on it.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I just had a question regarding colonialism. Because like in ecology, we do talk a lot about like invasive species and how just invasive species are just like being all around the globe. And there's been this very interesting link to invasive species from the UK going to places where the British Empire colonized all around. Do you know if like especially in Sudan, there's been there was like this peak in invasive species because invasive species will destroy ecosystems at the end of the day. Is there any data on what was the importance of invasive species in this deterioration?
There's literally like zero research mostly on the environment in Sudan, mostly limited due to the access to the source and the fact that the country is currently in the brink of a civil war. But the most invasive species that entered Sudan was man. Hunters, British hunters, American hunters who went for tourism in Sudan in the 1820s to the 1880s, nearly pushed to extinction most wild species. We're speaking about crocodile, the Nile crocodile disappeared in Sudan for a time. Elephants were in the northern Sudan now are only found in South Sudan. Giraffes, rhinoceros, even most species of bird began to disappear during this period because there is mass hunting and mostly a disappearance of the forest or the riverine place. But most of the species that we see that enter the region are botanical. The Egyptian indirectly introduced many plant species, mostly for cultivation, but sometimes accidentally. But the most interesting one are the fact that also plant species from Sudan also leave the country and become more and more present in the Occident. For example, most people know Egyptian cotton as being Egyptian, but the most common sort of Egyptian cotton came from Sudan during this period. And it's now one of the most dominant species of the plant. And it came because the colonizer wanted to bring back the plant to extort the most value out of it. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
This isn't a question. I just wanted to sort of expand because I should have stopped to think a little bit about the rights of nature. One legal theorist believes that the power of the rights of nature and why it may take root is that the direct analogy is corporate personhood. So we're taking corporate personhood, which is, a foundational or at least a very central part of neoliberalism, and applying it to elements of nature. So we're having natural personhood. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out.
Perfect. My next question is for William. So just regarding the findings of your study, did you guys look at, well, since it's like an annual study, both of the data sources, did you guys look at the historical trends? Were there any sort of patterns within the technosphere? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, that's, great question. It's something that I wanted to do. The issue with, for example, the time use survey side, like your daily activities, those have been around for a long time, but really concentrated to a handful of countries. And the only country that has a continuous time series for any appreciable amount of time is the US. So we haven't looked at time series yet, but specifically, so for economic activity, there's a lot more promise there because the data goes back way further. And specifically, actually, with the technosphere, it's really what I'm interested in the next few months is to put together this long-term time series of our employment and our estimate of our time going towards building up our material world and how that's changed. Something I'm totally interested in looking at, and I expect, in a relative share, in absolute numbers, it's probably going up because our human population is rising. But as a relative share of our total time spent on our economic activities, if it's declining, a question I'm interested in is it decoupling? Are we continuing to grow exponentially, 2 to 3% per year on a mass basis? If that's decoupling from our time input, that's a quite interesting result. And then goes into sort of the productivity that Sophie was talking about. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just something that came to mind when you talked about the occupational perspective, Sophie. What does it mean for us PhDs that are sometimes very obsessed about productivity? I think it's the right space to ask that question.
Yeah, productivity in academia, right? It's a big topic. So the meme that was at the end of my presentation was the fact that what does it mean to, I don't know if you know Yann LeCun, that was on that social media exchange, who's huge name in computer science, saying that they published 80 papers in 2 years. Is that a good thing? I'm asking you, I don't know. Does it bring anything of value? That's another question. So personally, that's my overarching, I would say, aim, is that as long as it is the dominant perspective, we can hardly fight against because we don't have the power. You can choose your PhD director and your university, maybe. Some have some different paradigms. I know that that's something that can affect your quality of life, and I think quality of life is very important. But for now, it's certainly something that's kind of out of reach to have control over. So it's a total change of paradigm in that sense. Yeah. So lots to do, right, in front of us.
I just want to add a comment regarding personhood to nature. One of the problems with that is that, of course, we could give rights to nature, but the problem is how do we ascribe responsibility to, say, if a river is taken as given certain personhood. That is one of the problem, is how to put responsibilities on a river.
We're getting slightly above my pay grade here, but I have more to investigate in this, but the way it's been explained to me that the challenge, as with corporate personhood, is to define who will speak for the river. So once you have somebody, a human representative who will speak for that river, that agent of the river, that voice for the river, and I'm talking about the river because of the Magpie River in Quebec, which has been designated by the regional municipality and the indigenous nation in that area. It's not been tested in court, but it has been officially recognized. So once you find out who speaks for the river, then that person will hold others to account for it, is my understanding of how it will work.
I think we have time for one last question.
This is about colonization. I read somewhere that around the pyramids of Egypt, at one time, there was a lot of wooded areas, there were trees, and ancient Egyptians burnt all those trees to melt the gold to produce the statues and copper. Is there any truth to that?
I'm not specialized outside the 19th century, so I couldn't answer that question, but most of the riverine region in the Nile was at one time forested. It's quite limited. Most of the forests are only 1 mile on each side, and sometimes only on 100 meters. So you can imagine it's quite a limited sizes for the forest. So it's not long before you can just cut it down, and once you cut it down, it has a hard time to regrow because the trees act as a barrier to the sand dunes. And when the trees are gone, the sands can go next to the water level. So I cannot, it's my best way to answer that question, but I cannot, I have no answer for that.
Thank you.
Can I just add something to that? And this is totally not my area, but it's something that I read quite recently that researchers have discovered, or like this is just in the last few months, have discovered what they think are evidence of canals that are different from the current path of the Nile, and that some of them came very close to where the pyramids are. And so that this is by way of explaining how the labor to create the pyramids was made easier because there was a water course that was going right by. But I imagine from what Gabriel is saying, that if the river course was closer to the pyramids, there would have been forests closer to the pyramids, I'm guessing.
Thank you so much for our participants for asking questions, and thank you so much for our presenters. So it's time to wrap up the session. We have a break, and we will come back for the next session at 2:50. Enjoy your break.